Good afternoon and welcome to today's session on neurodiversity and dyslexia. I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join us today in such an important topic. And we're really keen today to make the session interactive. So if you do have any questions that you want to ask during the session, you can direct these to our panellists. And please use the chat function, not the Q&A function. It is the chat function in Zoom, and I will endeavour to make sure that we get as many of those questions answered as possible. I'm delighted today that I'm being joined by Wendy Byrne, who's a senior business analyst from Aviva, and also Laura Harman, who is an autism spectrum consultant from the Untapped Group. And they're going to be answering a lot of your questions today and sharing their lived experience of neurodivergency. So let's just think about what that means. Dr. Nick Walker describes neurodivergence as diversity of the brain and mind. And that's a lovely simplified and succinct way of summarising what neurodivergence is and what we're going to be talking about today. Indeed, neurodivergence can be described as the different ways the brain functions, learns and processes information compared to the people that are neurotypical. And it includes many conditions, including ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia. We're going to be putting a little bit more emphasis as well on dyslexia today as one of the key conditions within neurodivergency that we'll be exploring as well. So I'd love to start by just starting with you, Wendy, and asking you, what has your experience of being neurodivergent been? How did you first identify it and what were some of the characteristics?
Yeah, I was probably about 7 years old in the 1970s, and my mum decided that, she spotted that there were some problems, and it was mainly, she identified that it was spelling and also reading out loud, and she compared me, I suppose, to my older brother who was excelling at those kind of things, and she thought, there's a problem here. And against my classmates as well, I was falling behind quite quickly. So yeah, that's really when I was identified. However, back then in the 70s, it wasn't really known. Dyslexia wasn't a term that was common, and so therefore the support and the help that was probably needed at that time just didn't get found.
Given. And how did that make you feel as a child growing up? Did that affect your confidence, or what were the kinds of things it made you feel when you were at school at that point?
Well, it was really difficult because you feel you're in class every day, every week, every month, every year, and you're having to experience the same kind of struggles. And, for example, you'd get asked to read out loud, and that would just be awful because each time I did it, I just got worse and worse. So the words would be jumping around on the page. I'd struggle to pronounce something, and all you can hear is the kids sniggering in the background. And every time you come to do it, your anxiety just goes through the roof, and you would keep, the teachers would just keep asking you, and I'd cringe. So, yeah.
And I assume that started to create quite a negative framework as well of being at school, or being under that kind of pressure.
Absolutely. So school to me was torturous. It was just not a very nice experience, and I couldn't really wait to get out of there, to be honest. It just was horrible.
And Laura, was that a similar experience for you? I mean, this is what we're hearing. Does it resonate? Was it a similar story?
Very, very similar story. I wasn't diagnosed until I was at university, actually, so it had gone unrecognised up to that point. And I think it had been unrecognised because I was a talker. I could always talk and articulate myself really well, but when it came to putting that into writing, that's where I was struggling and having difficulty. So my experiences through primary, middle, secondary school were very much tainted with that brush as the one that just wasn't putting in the effort, the one that was messing about or not listening because I wasn't following the instructions, or I wasn't getting things right, and I wasn't doing my homework on time, or whatever it may have been. So I had a really negative experience through those years where teachers almost dissociated themselves with me in thinking, well, if you're not going to try, then we're not going to teach you, was the message that I was getting, when actually people just weren't really delving into the whys, what's underlying here. You know, have you understood the instructions? Do you want a bit of support? Do I need to adapt my teaching style to your learning style so that, for instance, you know, I can model it to you, I can do a walkthrough to you, rather than just giving a set of instructions for me to try to process. So very similar in that way. And I actually work alongside a lot of neurodivergent people and hear very similar stories time after time, whether it is dyslexia, other learning difficulties, autism, ADHD. It's really common, people describing it as being a square peg trying to be fit into the round hole.
Yeah.
That the system wasn't adjusting around their needs, they were expected to try to fit in to that. And as you mentioned, Wendy, you end up feeling very self-conscious. You end up, for myself, withdrawing even from a lot of social relationships because you felt inadequate in a way, that you weren't at the same achievements and the same standard to others in the class.
And these are really formative years as well, so it's really important. I mean, Wendy, from your experience, did that, how did you fare in the education system with that? Did it start to make you, do you think you performed less well because there wasn't this support structure and thing around you?
I think in the areas I did exceed, I didn't completely fail. I was pretty good at sport and I was good at maths and I was really good at art. So all the creative and the strengths, came out in that sense. But English, French, history, anything that involved words and having to read lots of chunks of information, I really did struggle. And like I said, I never got any support. So as soon as I could leave, I did do A-levels and realised that was really tough. So I ended up just saying, no, I've had enough of this. Thank God I want to leave. Have a passion for learning.
Yeah.
And thankfully that hasn't ever left me. But the experience in school definitely had a huge impact in terms of my mental health, although we didn't call it that back then. But the mental health side of it, is so important that children do get identified as early as possible so that they have, the right mindset and the growth that they can lean into and thrive in a good environment. And I'm afraid I don't think the school system, even today, is letting kids down because if you look at the stats, 1 in 5 have been diagnosed as being dyslexic, but even those that are not are identified, again, there's 1 in 5 that are not have not been. Get myself muddled here. Have not been identified in school. So 80% are therefore leaving without knowing that they're actually dyslexic. And those 80% that are leaving school that have not been supported are actually going into the workplace or perhaps prison. Through the system, basically. It's reflected completely at the employment statistics. So if we think that approximately 10 to 15% of the population are neurodivergent that we know of at this time, when we look at employment statistics, neurodivergent groups are far less likely to be in employment. So if I take autism, for instance, it's approximately 1 in 70 with a diagnosis on the autism spectrum, yet fewer than 30% of those autistic individuals are in employment.
And that's a staggering number, isn't it?
That's a huge number.
A huge potential source of great talent that's going
completely untapped talent that is just being left there, not utilised. Because people don't have the awareness and the understanding of the condition. And actually, when you can understand what those different thinking, learning styles are for people, make the adjustments around people so that they can access those environments and really play to their full potential, there's a huge amount of talent out there that we're not utilising.
And I know we were talking about this earlier because we were talking about the criticality of those formative years. And one of the staggering statistics I think we showed was actually the number of people that end up that are neurodivergent in the prison system, and I think it was 50%.
Approximately half of the prison population are neurodivergent, which just goes to show that, you know, it goes back to those early school years, doesn't it, of having the understanding of individual needs, learning styles, reasonable adjustments that need to be made for people. If we can get that right, it sets people up on that pathway for development and success.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks volumes when you look at the prison population that have a diagnosis as neurodivergence.
Because that leads to frustration. If you're not being understood, if you're not in an environment where you can thrive, you're going to be impacted in other ways. And if you believe the narrative, you know, that you are stupid, thick, and what have you, then, you know, at the end of the day,
you withdraw from
it, and you end up in a dark place, such as prison.
Absolutely. And Wendy, I'm thinking that you mentioned a really important point, that we absolutely mustn't conflate neurodivergence with intelligence.
Yes.
You know, that neurodivergence doesn't mean you are less intelligent than neurotypical people. And in fact, in many ways, as we'll explore later, there's a lot of very untapped potential that can actually add huge value to organisations above and beyond that of neurotypical people in some instances.
Absolutely.
So it's really important that we get this framing right. I mean, from your perspective, Laura, you mentioned that you weren't diagnosed, or you weren't aware of the diagnosis until in your university years, and that you'd been, I think you said, almost seen as a disruptor, somebody that wasn't going to wasn't interested in learning, rather than understanding why you were having difficulty in some areas with learning. What was the impact of that on your self-esteem and confidence?
Yeah, I almost started to behave as I was being told I was, if I'm honest. I did withdraw from, you know, a lot of my education. I lost interest. What I found was the subjects where I had the most interest, or subjects where I was doing well, were very dependent upon the teacher that I had, on whether the teacher was able to understand what my individual learning style was. And for those that weren't adapting to me, those were the sessions that I was withdrawing from. So when I came out of GCSEs, I didn't go straight onto A-levels because I didn't believe that I could achieve in A-levels. So I actually went away and did a vocational qualification, thinking that that's, you know, what I needed to do, something very practical, which actually was a big confidence boost for me at the time. But I just didn't believe that I could. And it was only later down the line when I did, because I aspired to go to university, so I did then go on to do my A-levels, and it was just such a door being opened for me when one of the lecturers, my professors at university, picked up on it and actually said to me, "You articulate yourself so well when we have a conversation and we're discussing a topic, but when you're putting that into your writing, into your assignments, it doesn't come across." And it just made sense for me then. Like, oh, okay, so I can. He's saying I can have a very intellectual conversation, but it's just the writing element that I was struggling with. So
and it really helps to validate you and give you self-esteem.
It does, it's that realisation that it isn't an intelligence thing, it's actually...
Absolutely not. And Wendy, from your experience, you know, how important is a diagnosis? How important was it for you?
Oh, it's hugely important because... like I said, I knew from an early age, or my mum knew from an early age, that I had difficulties. And back then, like I said, there was no assessment. And literally in my early 20s, when I first started working, the GP was my first port of call to go to literally, you know, say, I think there's a problem here. And it wasn't until in my 30s that I finally got promotions at work, put me in a very vulnerable position because it involved a lot more reading and a lot more writing of reports, and I just felt like totally out of my depth and overwhelmed by it. So I went for an assessment, and I thought it's very expensive and you still have to pay for it today, which is a bit of a bone of contention because it's not inclusive, because some people cannot afford it. So, but it was the best investment because it validated, first of all, that I wasn't stupid and thick, because this report in my 30s said, you're academic. That was the first time that I'd ever really saw it in black and white, and that a professional had said, you are academic, you know, you've got that. And I was like, but intelligence, I'm not intelligent, you know, because that was the narrative that I'd been fed. So it's very hard in your 30s to start thinking of yourself differently and having to reframe it. But it was a great opportunity because that report did lead me to understand what my challenges were. And I think over the next 2 decades, I think I kept focusing on that because I suppose that's the habit, isn't it? You get fed and people do talk about your challenges. So I did that. Even today, if you are to Google dyslexia into Google, it'll all come up with all the challenges. And we've got to reframe that. We've got to get that balance back in terms of, yes, okay, you've got challenges and it's great to be open about that, but you've got to also understand what your strengths are.
Yeah.
And I've only really come into that in the last couple of years where I think, oh, that's my dyslexic thinking coming in to play.
Yeah. I think part of the difficulty with that is exactly as you said, the diagnosis through the GP is so much neurodivergence is medicalised still.
Yeah.
It's a medical model, even though we're saying we've moved away from the medical model, we're into social models of disability. But actually, when you're needing to go through a GP to gain a diagnosis for a learning difference, that is already putting a huge sticker on you as it being deficit rather than difference.
Yeah.
Whereas actually it is shifting that focus from deficit to difference. There is a difference, and from that difference there's going to be pros and there's going to be cons, and there's going to be strengths and there's going to be areas that you find more difficult, and that's where the focus needs to lie, because we can then tap into what are those strengths, what are those skills that you probably are more creative and innovative than the rest of the population who don't have a diagnosis, and how can we really utilise those in an employment sense, which overall is what we're aiming for when we go through the education system, is getting into meaningful adulthood employment.
Yeah. And you're bringing up a really important point. We're really beginning to explore those barriers. What are the barriers that have created this way of things? One of the points you just brought up there is this, I love your term of medicalisation of the problem. And that extends even further into the language, isn't it? Because in terms of within the legal framework, it's really only addressed through disability. As being a mental impairment that can have an impact on your day-to-day routines over and above someone else. And a lot of the words are dis words, aren't they? Like disability, dyslexia. Absolutely. How do you think that affects the narrative and affects the population that are affected, part of the neurodivergent community? What would you say?
I mean, from my perspective, I work alongside neurodivergent people in many different job roles, and I think this comes down to stigma and the experience that I can see people are having through, the terminology that is placed, or the misunderstanding, misinterpretation of what autism, dyslexia, ADHD and neurodivergence is. It puts a stigma on people, and then there are assumptions made about people, assumptions about their intelligence, assumptions about what people can do, what they can't do, what they should do, which actually is taking away an awful lot of autonomy for people. Other people start to make decisions for them. So I think it can go as far as impacting people's choices and their own aspirations, because people around them start making the decisions for them. So there's a lot more barriers that are faced for people.
I think some of the barriers can be self-imposed as well, because you're being fed that narrative. When you're growing up, you keep hearing those kind of messages, you start believing it.
Yeah.
And so therefore I think the biggest barrier was myself.
Self-esteem.
Self-esteem and battling with imposter syndrome and, just kind of mental health issues as recent as, last year, to be honest. And everything kind of surfaces back up again, and you've got to, feel that you've got to deal with that today. The trauma of what happened in my school life comes up day in, day out. And so therefore with people that I work with in the last couple of years, I've started to try to not start with myself in terms of educating myself and understanding a little bit more about myself, the challenges, and then taking small steps to open up to people and say, look, I do have these challenges and this is what I need. And starting to understand what you need to help with those. And then you can lean into your strengths, because then once you understand what your strengths are,
Absolutely.
you can really fly.
And I think hearing you talk, Wendy, one of the really sad things is that you've had to do a lot of that for yourself, whereas actually surely it's about us being able to support people, you know, to be able to recognise. I say I work in employment programmes of autistic individuals, and the statistics on pieces of research are that technically, and this is very technical roles that people are undertaking, cybersecurity, it might be software testing roles, their technical work, they're up to 30 to 40% more productive than people that don't have a diagnosis. Straight the way telling about the value that's there for these different thinkers. The employment programme side of things is actually there to support people with the workplace skills. The things that you're sort of talking about, which is recognising actually this person has a difficulty to sit in a meeting and to communicate effectively with another person. So we need to support them in learning the scripts, learning the social rules around that, whatever it may be. Or indeed, you know, assistive technologies could be another area which could be identified. If this person's having a difficulty to put their words into writing, then there are different supports and aids out there for them. But
it's very interesting what you're saying here, because obviously we're talking about, you know, there are barriers in terms of, as we say, the way the setup, there are barriers in terms of the self, and I think that's a really important point. And giving licence to people to feel able to not only examine what they need support in, but also to feel reassurance that they've actually got all these other strengths as well. So when we're thinking about barriers, are there also barriers in terms of some of the systems that are being operated, in terms of like recruitment processes or things like that? Are there barriers there that we're experiencing? So, I mean, if I go to you, Wendy, first, I can see lots to talk about here. What would be some of the barriers that you think exist within processes like that, or other processes within the workplace that act as barriers to individuals that are neurodivergent?
I think companies are starting to realise that they have to change the process. So for example, the recruitment, because I've gone for a couple of jobs and internally, and I got a knockback because I just simply couldn't write down the right stuff. They gave me a test, and and even though they give you extra time, it's not enough. Just the extra time. There's more that needs to be done. For example, when somebody is actually giving you a question, because of the way that you process the information, because that's really what dyslexia is about. Yes, there's challenges in terms of reading and writing, but it's how you actually think, it's how you're made, because it's something you're born with. And so when people are talking to you, you're processing, and you've got quite a short-term memory, a very small memory that you're using to process that. So, you know, when you're in an interview and somebody's asking you a question, and it can be quite long, some of the business analyst types of questions I get asked, I kind of think, I can't remember what the beginning of that was, and you kind of think, if you could just put it on the screen or somehow or another give me it written, I'll be able to process it, because I can read it, and then and bang, I'll be okay to do that. So I've failed a couple of interviews recently, well, a couple of years ago, not too recent, but I was actually blessed that the person that was recruiting actually spotted potential, and then afterwards gave me a secondment. Then I was able to prove that I could do that particular job. Fantastic. And I got it that way. So, you know, it just put the fear of God into me, recruitment processes at the minute.
So this is striking on something really important, like we're saying, barriers, because we perhaps conventionally, traditionally, there's been kind of one process, and it's largely been aimed at neurotypical people that process in the same way potentially or more similarly. I know, obviously, Laura, from your experience, you've worked a lot with people and been really thought through this process. How can we make changes so something like that isn't a barrier? Can you share with us some examples?
Yeah, I mean, the programmes I work with Untapped with, it's around, exactly as you mentioned, Wendy, recognising people's skills and abilities, not assessing them based upon their social skills and first impressions. So the programmes that we run, we don't follow traditional recruitment processes. We are careful about the job adverts that we put out in the first place, so that the wording is true to what the job role is. So a lot of job adverts can have very generalised language in them, such as need to be a team player or need to have good communication skills. Whereas actually, on true reflection, they may not be key to the job role itself. What is actually needed is somebody who can sit there and analyse lots of data to put that into a report for people to read, for instance. So it's thinking about the language we're using so that people are attracted to jobs and don't take a look at that advert and instantly rule themselves out, even though they probably have the ability to undertake a role. Then it's very much about recruitment processes. We don't follow traditional interviews, for instance. You mentioned there, Wendy, they can be extremely anxiety triggering. I've been there myself, and just felt from the instant of walking in, oh gosh, I've given the wrong impression straight away. I can see immediately people are turning away from me. I've said the wrong thing. I've not answered the correct question correctly. So being able to allow people to prove their ability. So give assessments during job application processes so that people can show you, yeah, I can follow that task, I can follow the instruction, I can give you the information that you need, rather than having someone sat spotlighted, open-ended questions, which it can be difficult to decipher what bits of information might you want from me here, and play to people's strengths in that way. So it absolutely begins with recruitment. I agree.
Not creating those artificial barriers, like you say, and something like open questions. I mean, I think you were educating me earlier, which I found really interesting when you were saying, if you ask someone a question, tell me about yourself.
Gosh, yes.
And they haven't had the parameters put around that. They may start at birth, and that's just because they're taking it very literally. And there are things we can do with flexible thinking that will accommodate that much better.
We have to be a lot more careful with our language use, I feel, because neurodivergent population tap in far more to the meaning of language, whereas a lot of neurotypicals can throw language around and not really think about the true meaning of it. But exactly that open-ended questions, that asking someone, tell me about yourself, what does it mean? Do you really want to know everything about myself, or is it just these key bits of information, and what relevance is it to this? And so it's thinking of language.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in as well that I just want to put to you as well while we're going through. So I could start with you, Wendy. One of the questions that has come in is, knowing what you know now, if you could give one piece of advice to your younger self going through the challenges of school, what would it be?
Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? I think personally, I would say that the hard work pays off. If I could say to a 7-year-old and get them to listen, that, you know, in the end, keep practicing, keep working hard, because, you know, you are just as clever as anybody else. It's just a question of you will succeed. So don't believe everything that you hear, and believe in yourself, which is really hard to do when you're battling with lots of messages that are
well, like you say, particularly when the narrative has been negative, you've got to actually allow that positive message to come through and persevere there. Anything you'd add to that?
I think I would just add to that, and it's hard, like you said, to tell a 7-year-old, but I think it's don't compare yourself to other people. That was one of the biggest things that was knocking my confidence growing up, is it was always, well, my brother can do that and my friends can do that, and why are they able to do their homework in half an hour and it's taking me 3 hours? So it's not to compare yourself to other people, and more focus on your steps of where you want to be going, your successes, and celebrate those successes as well, not by other people's standards, by actually what you're achieving.
Which is really important. We've got a lovely comment here, actually, Rachel, who's just commented on one part of what we were picking up on before when we were talking about recruitment processes and our need to be flexible. And she's just commented here that they ask in their recruitment process whether any adjustments are required, and if candidates need to do a test, just doing things as simple as send it out the day before, so that they can prepare themselves. And I think that's, again, these small things are some things we've got to become more flexible about, haven't it, so that we can make the environment. And I think really importantly, not treat all neurodivergents as the same. There's a danger neurodivergent people are still individuals, and their needs will be different. And so how important is that, actually thinking about the types of adjustments that might be necessary?
Absolutely. It was the next thing after the recruitment that I've got noted down to talk about when we're creating positive environments is individual profiling. Complete understanding not of the conditions. It's important to have an awareness within a culture around different conditions and those differences in thinking and processing. But actually, it's then important as the next step to understand the individual. And by that, I mean understand what the individual strengths are, understand any difficulties the person may have relating to perhaps their executive functioning, for one example, which includes things like planning and organisation and managing stresses and things like that. And the more we get to understand about those elements and people's communication preferences and any distractions within the environment, for instance, sensory information that can be acting as a distractor for people, the more we understand about those individual characteristics for the person, whether it relates to their diagnosis or not, the quicker we can identify, okay, these are the adjustments that we can be making. If the environment for you is too noisy with the background chatter that's going on, let's look at noise cancelling headphones that you can be wearing whilst you're working. If you're distracted by people that are walking around you, let's pop you in the corner next to the window so that you don't have that distraction. If you've got, like myself, absolutely appalling short-term memory, rather than just telling you the information and instructions, let's get it written out for you. Let's have you practically doing alongside someone. So those individual elements for someone is really, really important, because yes, there are the, more identifiable factors to each of the diagnosis, but that's going to vary person to person and day to day and hour to hour, to be honest with you, because when there's fluctuations with stressors, that can impact upon your processing and your thinking and your communication style as well. So it's awareness.
And these are all really accessible things potentially we can do. So we've started moving from the barriers to actually exploring, well, how do we create these environments that are more accessible? And you've mentioned some of those things. And of course, behind all this as well is taking the time, isn't it? We've got to make sure that organisations, line managers, people involved in the brain take time to understand and take time to then think about those different needs. Well, sorry, I can see the
you're going to come in there. I'll let you go,
Wendy.
I was interested with what Rachel said as well, because just going back a step, because I think it is about relying in that instance for the individual to know in the first instance what they need.
Yes.
So I think it's really important to understand that, like 1 in 5 people are dyslexic. Going back to that 80% figure of leaving school that are not being identified, that's quite a big number. And then when they go into the workplace and you're asked that great question, which Rachel said, we ask them what they need. What happens if they don't know what they need? So that's the problem. It's trying to get to that root of the problem to make sure that everybody at school does get that fair assessment. And listening to what you were saying as well, Laura, I've lost my thought. There was a train of thought that while I was listening to you, but I can't remember what it was now.
That's fine.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah. Again, I'm going back to what you were saying, Wendy, around mental health and the impacts that it can have on people feeling that they can't, or imposter syndrome, that, I don't belong here, people, must be judging me. And I've just got a quotation from a lady, an autistic lady, telling us about her employment. And she said, I feel quite emotional every time someone says to me, is there anything I can do to make this more accessible for you? Or, I don't know much about autism, but please tell me so that I know if there's anything that I can do to support you. The truth is I get emotional because I haven't heard that many times and I'm still getting used to it, and I'm extremely grateful to all of those who have asked it so far. Yeah. And I think that taps into it, that even if the person doesn't know exactly what it is for themselves, that recognition from others around them that this isn't a condition that you have to cover up and you have to mask and you have to hide. You're actually in a safe, supportive space. Yeah. And we don't have all of the answers, as you may not have all of the answers, but we want to understand, we want to learn, and we want to see if there are things that we can do to support you better.
And there's a real key balance here, because there's two things I'm hearing coming out of that. One is this showing empathy and demonstrating in the things that we do in our behaviours that we are open and supportive of neurodivergent people, but also not in that openness, also balancing that with being proactive, so we don't just put the onus on someone to know what they should know, but that we're actually proactively offering that as well.
75% of people that are actually diagnosed of having dyslexia, 3 in 4 of them will hide it from their employer. So that's the thing that we need to change. And it's hard to be open about things that you feel like you're failing. And like I said, I think we need to address the balance. Yes, we need to understand what the challenges are, be open about those, and be able to have that discussion, and maybe just start with small steps. Start with a person that you know that's dyslexic, or probably start with your manager if you feel comfortable, or like I said, with someone that you know is dyslexic. And really just start there, and then just not only look at the challenges and look at the ways in which you can be supported. Often enough, I've sat there, someone has asked me that, and I honestly don't know what I need. In years gone by, you know, if someone has asked me that, and then more recently, I'm more aware of what I can do to help myself. But I think also you can then lean into the strengths.
And there's a couple of things, again, that it's not black and white either. It's not like, what do you need and this is it. It is about collaborating with individuals, having a dialogue and understanding what that need is. In fact, we've got some interesting, again, more questions coming in. So if I can just take a moment. So I'll put the first one to you, Laura. One of the questions is, have you got any advice to be more inclusive during the actual interview process, or what to avoid as such to be more inclusive?
And again, it's just thinking about individual learning styles. Everybody's different, so you want to make it inclusive to all. So for instance, we run through assessment process for a lot of autistic individuals. For autism, it's quite common that there are going to be quite big differences between social communication styles. So it's about understanding that we're not here to judge someone based upon, can they hold a two-way conversation with me, can they answer my questions as I'm putting it to them. It's strengths-based. So here's the job involves coding, pattern spotting, numbers. Let's get some tasks and have the person show to us, I'm able to do this, rather than have someone sat there conversating with me. You mentioned some great ones yourself, Sandy, actually providing information. So, you know, give questions prior to the interview, and I've come across it many times where employers say, oh no, but we can't do that because that's giving them advantage. Not if you're doing it for everyone, it isn't. And actually, by not providing questions pre-interview, all you're doing is testing somebody on their instant recall and memory skills, whereas again, that's not what they're there to be interviewed for. We're not interviewing you for a job where you have to have a fantastic memory. We want to know, can you do? So by providing the questions in advance, it's just allowing people to, exactly as we did for this webinar, I've got my notes in front of me, because without them, I wouldn't have my prompts. So it allows people to plan, to prepare. Particularly if people have an executive dysfunction in those areas, that's going to support that dysfunction and allow them to really want to get the information organised so that they can get it across as they need to, rather than feeling that they're put on the spot. So certainly, as I said, think about adverts, think about the information you want to collect during your application processes, and think about how are you going to run that interview process itself. Is it important to have a panel of questions, or is it important to have some assessments? Is it a bit of both? But make sure it is actually assessing people based on the skills that are relevant for the job, not just following a traditional process of
and taking that holistic view. I mean, I think I read as well, Ernst & Young has been ahead of the game in some areas where they've actually started to put on adverts proactively that they encourage applications from people that self-identify as neurodivergent, because they recognise the value that can bring, and actually positively framing that in the recruitment process. I've got another question here. Let me put this one to you, Wendy. It says, this person said, what I've noticed is that I can make adjustments for myself and I have my strategies for regulation, but I can see that there are some colleagues that struggle and either leave or suffer with stress. How do we tackle making things better in the workplace if people don't know they are neurodivergent, or if they know, if they don't know, what helps?
That's a great long question.
But essentially it's what absolutely.
I think I've forgotten the
So
first
really
bit.
it's saying, no, so well it's saying,
Yeah.
you know, if you do recognise you've got adjustments or whether you don't recognise what they're, how can we help people to recognise it? What can we do proactively to almost look for symptoms, I guess, in the workplace and encourage people to feel they can be open about that?
I think it does start with culture, and you need to feel like you're in a safe environment to be your best, to thrive, and to be your best self. You need to feel comfortable, and that's what I didn't feel in school. I didn't feel comfortable and always awkward and overwhelmed with everything. Whereas in work, you know, I'm very blessed to be in an environment and a culture where it's very supportive, and they, you know, encourage. And I think really there's a bit of a surge coming, so bear with me on this one because I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent, but you know, sadly George Floyd was murdered in 2021, was it around that time? And really we reacted as a community, as global, you know, it was a massive impact, and basically you know, in work, we were given training pretty much overnight to talk about our unconscious bias, and that really surfaced a massive bell. You know, it really resonated with the training, not just on a kind of black racist kind of level, but on my own dyslexic level, on you know, lesbians and gays, etc. You know, on every single level, we need to be more inclusive, and we need to be aware of our own biased, unconscious biases. And I think that is coming into the recruitment process. So I think that was the point I was trying to make earlier. But in order to answer the question, I think we are now living in a time where I think we are talking about these things more often now. But we can't just sit back. I had my assessment done in my 30s. I'm in my 50s now, 2 decades. And I was waiting for change, and I was waiting for other people to come along and make that change. And it got to a point when I got that training in 2021 that it made me really, really think hard about, well, if I need the change, I've got to start with myself. And I've got to really start. So I made small steps, came out to my manager. My manager was really supportive and wanted to help and learn, and actually admitted, I don't really know much about this. So I knew we were at a starting point where, you know, you have to make those small steps. So I think, you know, you've just got to start somewhere, and trying to change the whole world at once is not possibly something I can do. But within my own control, within my own workplace, I started to feel more comfortable. And once I had that first conversation with my manager, I then could understand. I did a lot more research. I found some resources online which were really, really helpful, and Aviva you know, signposted the training from the Black Lives Matter as well. I think I could be getting muddled up there, but they definitely signposted. There is some neurodivergent training, and they do signpost quite a bit of resource onto that. So I think,
and I think we'll develop that as well. I mean, this is really important because it is quite touching to me when I hear you say, you know, I came out, and that's how you felt about your diagnosis. That until you were in your 50s, you didn't feel you could openly talk about it for fear of it having a negative stigma, which we need to remove. And in fact, that actually relates to the next question. Actually, that's come up from someone. They actually said, what do you do if you constantly feel like you have imposter syndrome in meetings? Is there any advice to help them? From your experience, Laura, is there anything you can suggest there?
Straight away, my thoughts there are the most requested reasonable adjustment that neurodivergent people ask for is feedback. With imposter syndrome, if we're not receiving the meaningful feedback to us that yes, you are doing a good job, or you need to make a small tweak here, or you need to change course, or you need to meet this deadline, you need to cut this bit out, you're going into too much detail in this area. If you're not provided with that regular feedback, then what all of us naturally do is our brains fill in the blanks and we make assumptions. And those assumptions quite commonly for neurodivergent people are either I'm doing a fantastic job when they're completely off course, or their assumption is I'm failing, imposter syndrome, I'm really bad at this, I'm not being told, when actually they're doing a fantastic job, and the reason they're not getting the feedback is because they're just doing so well and just getting on with it. So feedback would be the biggest thing I suggest for anyone that is neurodivergent, that is thinking, you know, I really do suffer with this anxiety and feelings that, you know, I am not achieving, not doing as they want me to be doing. Request to your line managers, is there a possibility, you know, that we can touch base once a week, once a day if you need it, just so that I can let you know what I'm working on. You can just let me know, is that on the right tracks? And for managers, you know, people in the workplace who are aware of neurodivergent employees as well, just try to be focused on that. For any feedback that you would normally give, times it by 3.
Yeah.
Really do, because otherwise people are just making those assumptions for themselves, which quite often are going to be on the wrong track. So, yeah,
and that's really, again, an easy thing for organisations to do and for line managers to do if they're aware of it. Like I think you said there, sometimes it may be necessary to acknowledge and praise something that a neurotypical person may have done easily. But that reinforcement in terms of the value it can bring back and the morale and etc. can be absolutely priceless.
And it's only natural, isn't it, that we provide feedback when something's going wrong, but provide the feedback when something's going right, because otherwise people will make the assumption it is going wrong. And, you know, I've known of instances where people they've been aware that their work's being checked through and they've just made the assumption that everything's being changed and, you know, no one's letting them know, when actually that work was being sent higher up the chain to be praised at how well that person was doing, but they hadn't been informed. So, you know, whether it be in a meeting, how am I performing in a meeting, let your line manager know. If I could have some either instant feedback over the chat function, or if you can check in with me beforehand to let me know what the expectation is, and then afterwards let me know how did it go, so that I can build on that and, you know, develop.
That feedback loop is so important. Absolutely, totally.
And I think a lot of this is tapping into one of my observations is we know that it's a protected characteristic in terms of in the Equality Act of 2010, but actually what we're trying to do is say we must move beyond a legislative framework and embed this in cultural practices that will not only benefit the neurodivergent, but actually the neurotypical as well. They can have great upsides in terms of creating a good company ethos, good morale, having less stress, less anxiety, as well as being particularly powerful and supportive to people within the neurodivergent community. And I want to focus a little bit as well on that positive culture, because this isn't about something that organisations should feel is a chore to do. This is about something that has huge value. And there's a lovely quote that's coming. I must just share this with you. Someone has come in, Wendy, a colleague of yours, and has said, I work with Wendy and she's such a valued and important member of the team. It would have been such a waste of talent for her not to be where she is now. What advice would you give to people who feel their organisation is missing out on this pool of talent?
Where are all my work colleagues? Is my first question.
Let me start, because obviously, Laura, you work with so many different organisations. And how can you kind of start to sum up that this isn't about a one-way ticket? This is an enormously wonderful pool that we can tap into.
Absolutely. It's moving away from inclusivity being an obligation. We're not talking about obligations. We're not talking about, this disadvantaged group over here, we need to do more to include them, we need to do more, you know, to support them. This is about changing our viewpoint to saying there are so many skills deficits in employment currently, particularly in certain industries. You know, I'll go into analytics, into data, into IT. There are lots of areas where there is more talent needed. And actually this is about tapping into talent which is sat there and not being utilised. You know, 70% of autistic thinkers are not in work. Well, I can guarantee that out of those 70% of autistic people, there is talent there to fill those jobs gaps, those skills gaps. So rather than thinking, you know, we have an obligation to do this, or as you mentioned, Sandy, this is legislation and we should all be more inclusive, it's about, you know, we can enrich our teams, we can bring more value to our teams, having different thinkers is needed. If I can just say a quick quote that Chris Peckham, who some of you might be aware of, I went to hear him speak a couple of years ago at a conference, and he's autistic himself. on the telly a lot. He's an environmentalist, advocate, campaigner, and he started off his speech saying, if we didn't have neurodivergence, the human population would die out. It says it all. Yeah. If we don't have differences in thinking styles, differences in processing, innovation and creativity would die out, because we would all be neurotypical thinkers, we would be linear thinkers, and we wouldn't have, you know, the brain of a neurodivergent is firing through so many more neural pathways. We wouldn't have that, and we wouldn't keep evolving as a human race.
Statistics bear that out, don't they? Because I think I was reading a report by Julie Logan from the Cass Business School in London, and she said 20 to 40% of entrepreneurs are dyslexic thinkers. And I think actually when you widen that to the neurodivergent community, the number of entrepreneurs, the percentage is even higher. And there are some wonderful examples out there. I know, Wendy, you've had a chance to think about a few that from your experience. What would be some of the famous people that we know that are great examples of neurodivergent entrepreneurs?
Well, you've got brands such as Apple. So you've got Steve Jobs, that's it. You've got IKEA. You've got Virgin, Richard Branson there. Joe Malone, Soho House. So, you know, you've got some stuff there. You've also got, I think, a bit broader than just entrepreneurs. If you think of, well, designers, I suppose, you've got Tommy Hilfiger, Victoria Beckham, Alexander McQueen, Sir Paul Smith. I mean, I'm reading from a list here because I would not remember this. And then I think sports people, you know, the great Muhammad Ali, Lewis Hamilton, Sir Jackie Stewart, you know, there's so many.
It's
David
tremendous.
Beckham.
And this
so
really
many.
does exemplify the point that there's real value. These people have brought great innovations across all industries. We're not talking about in one pocket or one area.
Storytellers, actors,
It's
directors.
historical. If you look back at scientists, inventors, you know,
Einstein.
writers, it's the neurodivergence that are doing lots of the developments, whether it be in technology, whether it be in, you know, our entertainment business, whatever it be, you know, they are driving that change in development.
Well, you can either go as far back as the car. The car was invented by Henry Ford, who's dyslexic. The aeroplane was the Wright brothers. And you've also got something else that I can't remember.
It's fantastic.
There's so many examples of it.
And I think this is where we really need to encourage people to embrace. I've got time for probably one more question before we have to go to our tips and wrap-ups, which is tremendous. But actually, it does tie in with the thought that, in fact, the question that's coming was, where do you start when training managers on neurodivergence? And are there any recommendations on resources? If I put to you first, or Wendy, and then I know you've got some thoughts on that, Laura.
Well, in terms of dyslexia, you know, company resources, you need to look and see what's there. Often enough, companies do put out quite a bit of resources, but people don't tend to be proactive until there's a need, until there's a problem, and then they will actually go out and look. I think madebydyslexia.org, it's founded by Kate Griggs, who is dyslexic herself, and it's called madebydyslexia.org because it is, you're made by it, you're born with it, it's something that you inherited. And basically on her website, she's given free training for teachers. So we really need to start with the schools. If you can get the school system completely looked at, that would be great. Not going to happen, I suppose, overnight, but you know, that's really where you need to start with this problem. And I think in the workplace, she launched in October of last year, 2023, as recent as that, some resource for, it's an hour training, everything you need to know about dyslexia, everything that you need to know about how to support being a manager if you're the 80% that are not dyslexic, then that resource is out there online. So that's madebydyslexia.org. Take the training, it's only an hour, and if everyone can do that, then that's a good starting place.
Yeah, fabulous advice. And I know, obviously, when we're talking about neurodivergence, Laura, it goes wider as well than dyslexia.
It
Are there any other, because I know you've got great experience in this, any other links you'd recommend in terms of where to start?
Going to say, just first and foremost, when that question came in about just where do we start, I think the first thing to say is just start. Anywhere. You know, it is a cultural change. It is about people embracing and getting on board with it. So it's not about forcing training on people. It's about encouraging and inviting people in to that. So just start somewhere would be the first message. Coming from an employment angle, because I work very much with supporting people into sustainable employment, there is a fantastic resource on the Neurodiversity Hub. So that is www.neurodiversityhub.org. And if you have a look on there, that has been put together by different academic centres. It's had input from neurodivergent people themselves. It has buy-in from lots of different international organisations as well. And on there is support for individuals who are preparing for employment. So that may be for their first employment, or it might be preparing for an interview process or application process. So getting work ready. And then there's a great set of resources on there as well for employers. So lots of what we talked about with regards to environmental assessments, about individual profiling, understanding people's executive functioning skills, focusing on strengths-based, matching people to the right role, which actually is one of the key things for neurodivergence as well, is making sure that the job role is playing to people's strengths and we're not setting people up to fail. So lots of resources and reading on there as well that's really helpful to support both employers and neurodivergent people.
Fantastic. Well, those two websites alone, I think, are a great starting place. So amazing. We've cantered through. I know there's so much more we could talk about, but just by way of closing, William, today, if you were going to, when you reflect, think of one thing or piece of advice that you'd say to people, if this has whetted your appetite or you'd like to know more, whether you're within the community or seeking to support people within the community. Wendy, for you, what would be the one thing that you would suggest to people?
She says reaching for her book. So this is Dyslexia by Kate Griggs, and she is the lady that I talked about earlier, and she is dyslexic herself. So the book is actually written in a style that is great for us dyslexic people. So there's lots of QR codes that we can literally go to her website, which I mentioned earlier. So, you know, I'd say if you're dyslexic, definitely have a read of that. If you're not dyslexic, have a read of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. And what really struck me with that book is the layout being so user-friendly. It's not crowded with endless words. And you said many different media's used to kind of help.
I read over and glanced at it earlier and just thought, oh, I can understand that already just by looking at the format of it. So it's brilliant.
And Laura, for you, if you were your parting words in terms of reflections, one thing you'd encourage people maybe to do if they want to know more?
I think just as a passing phrase, it's keep in mind difference, not deficit. So when we are thinking neurodivergence, let's not be focusing on things people can't do. Let's think about difference. And one thing I would encourage people to do is go and have a bit of an internet search. Type in comparisons of neurodivergent brains to neurotypical brains, and it is such an amazing visual to help you understand exactly what neurodivergence is. So what you will see are neurodivergent brains which are firing across all the neural pathways, a really colourful picture of activity that is happening in a brain, compared to a neurotypical or a person who doesn't have neurodivergence condition diagnosis, which is a really linear thinking process. Now, it's not to say that either one or the other is better or worse than the other. What this is to say is we need all types of thinkers and actually look at all of that untapped talent that's sat there that we're not utilising. So do go and do a bit of research yourselves as well and have a look at those.
And they do say seeing is believing, so it's a great way of, you know, for people that need convincing, they can see that it's different. And if we were disbelieving before, it encourages us to think about we can do things differently, and that will be in the benefit of everybody.
And if you're like me and you find it hard to put things into words, having those pictures is a really strong image to help you understand it.
Fantastic. Well, I can't believe we we've reached time today already, so that it goes for me to say is obviously thank you both very much for being willing to share your wonderful insights and your own lived experience and such wonderful resources. Thank you to everybody who's been listening. We've had some fantastic questions, couldn't quite get to them all, but we've encouraged to get most of them, and we will also try and signpost when we will be putting the video recording up on our website at www.provek.co.uk, and we'll also try and signpost you to those couple of websites, particularly the Neurodiversity Hub and Made by Dyslexia websites that have such a wealth of resources. So all that remains for me to say is thank you very much for getting involved and getting the topic and the discussion even more into the mainstream, and we look forward to connecting with you again at our next webinar. Thank you very much.